Dear listeners, before we start today's story, please let us know your location in the comments section and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's start the story. My name is Evan Carter. I'm a typical 31-year-old man. My wife, Lila, is a 28-year-old, 5'7" blonde with a stunning presence. We met in college during my senior year, dated for 2 years, and married soon after her graduation. I was already employed at Rocketdyne Servos, a manufacturer of airplane parts, when we tied the knot. Lila and I met in an engineering class. On the first day, I was seated in the third tier when the door opened, and in walked the most beautiful blonde I had ever seen. She moved across the room gracefully, scanning the assembled students. She chose the empty seat next to me and sat down smoothly. She extended her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Lila. Lila Weber. And you are?" I shook her hand, trying to recall my name. My name's Evan. Evan Carter. Please call me Evan." She smiled and nodded. "Okay, Evan. Nice to meet you." That brief interaction sparked a 3-year courtship that culminated in our marriage the following year. During those years, I got to know her well. Lila was warm, affectionate, and had a nurturing quality about her. She loved babysitting the young children of our friends and often talked about how many children we would have, even before I proposed. We married in June and honeymooned in Hawaii. Lila had timed the wedding around her most fertile period, determined to get pregnant on our honeymoon. We made love almost hourly until we were both exhausted. Lila was convinced we had conceived. She affectionately referred to it as her bun in the oven after each session. My best friend, Brian, met Lila's older sister, Betty, at our wedding. They began dating soon after, and within a year, they were married. Betty, a year older than Lila, had auburn hair and was slightly taller. Brian matched my height at 6 feet and around 180 pounds. Brian had secured a position at an up-and-coming software company on the other side of town from my office. We bought homes side by side in a beautiful neighborhood situated between our workplaces. Betty and Lila both took part-time bookkeeping jobs at local businesses in the shopping mall. Brian and Betty had 3 children in their first 5 years of marriage. Lila and I had struggled to achieve the same happiness. Lila grew increasingly desperate. Despite everything we tried, she couldn't get pregnant. She frequently discussed her biological clock and her longing to be a mother. It became a source of concern for both of us. After multiple tests, it was revealed that my sperm count was low. The doctor assured us, however, that even with a low sperm count, there was a chance of conceiving with the right circumstances. In our 5th year of marriage, Lila joyfully announced she was pregnant with our first child, Sophie. Lila's happiness was immense because after 5 years of trying, we were finally expecting. I'll never forget the day she walked into my office, jumped into my lap, hugged me tightly, and gave me a deep kiss. With tears in her eyes, she held my face and said, "Well, Mr. Carter, I'd like to tell you that you're going to be a daddy." I was overjoyed. I held her tightly and asked, "Are you sure, hon? We've been trying for so long. This is really happening?" She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I found out today. It must have happened that night we watched the adult films. I know we were really hot for each other that night." I laughed and hugged her again. "Oh yeah, we were like animals that night, weren't we?" The pregnancy was smooth, and Lila gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Sophie. For the next 4 years, we shared a wonderful life together. But that happiness was short-lived. When Sophie prepared to enter pre-K Head Start classes, we had to go through various school requirements, including blood testing to ensure the school had accurate records for potential emergencies. It was during this testing process that everything began to unravel. I accompanied Sophie to the school on the blood testing day. She cried when the nurse took her small blood sample, but we comforted her until she stopped. The nurse then asked if she could take a sample from me to include in Sophie's database as a potential blood donor. I thought it was a good idea, so I allowed the nurse to draw a sample of my blood. Rolling down my sleeve and taking Sophie's hand, I gave it no more thought and left the school. Sophie and I went and had ice cream together. 2 days later, at my office, I received a call from the nurse. It took me a second to place her when she gave me her name. She said she was the school nurse who had drawn the blood samples. I said, "Oh hi. Is everything okay with the samples? I'm surprised to hear from you." "No, everything is not all right with the samples. I don't really know how to tell you this. It happens once in a while to either the husband or wife of a child tested." "What happens?" I asked. "Sophie has type O plus blood. You have type AB blood." "So what?" "That just means my wife, Lila, is the future blood donor, right?" "Well, Mr. Carter, no. It means that you cannot possibly be Sophie's biological father." The light in the room dimmed around me. My ears had a tremendous roaring sound. and my hand holding the telephone receiver began to shake violently. What? I mean, what? What the hell do you mean I am not Sophie's father? I gasped. There is no medical way that a type AB can be the parent of a type O child. Blood just does not work that way. I was hoping you would tell me that Sophie was adopted, but I can tell from your response that that is not the case. I am so sorry as to the implications that this has for you, the nurse said apologetically. I don't remember if I replied to her. I just remember later becoming aware that I still held the telephone and a dial tone was buzzing into my ear. This means Lila is screwing around on me. Or at least she was screwing around with someone when she got pregnant. She never changed her attitude or disposition toward me. I never noticed anything that would indicate she had been screwing someone else. How can I find out who she was with? Is she still seeing him? Can she cheat so easily as to never give me any indication that anything was amiss? I stewed over this for a couple of hours at the office and then called it day. I did not want to head home yet because I was still seeing red. I drove to the park and began walking around the lake path. I had walked about a half mile when it really hit me. Sophie is not my child. Yet, I have been paying for her care and upbringing while some a-hole Don Juan was sampling Lila's merchandise and leaving me with the expenses. I loved Sophie to death, but she was not my daughter anymore. How could Lila lie to me for so long about something this important? Why would she use me this way? I got madder and madder the more I thought about this whole situation. I calmed down and began thinking about what to do. A plan. I needed a plan. Okay, first thing, I will take Sophie to Crosstown Clinic and get DNA tests done on her and myself. That would be the final proof of Lila's cheating. The second thing to do is figure out if this cheating has ended or still going on. I'll need a recording device for our home's wireless phones. Let's see if she talks to the a-hole about their daughter. Let's see if she makes dates with him even now. If they are meeting, I can figure out later how to get audio or video evidence of the meetings. And then I can decide what the appropriate response is for both my cheating wife and the a-hole sleeping with her. But first things first. I drove to the nearest Radio Shack and found a small recording device that would activate when any of the house wireless phones were activated. So, if she were talking with him, I would catch it. The audio was captured to a memory stick. I could play the memory stick contents on my laptop PC. With the recording device and a dozen memory sticks in my shopping bag, I drove home. This was Lila's day at the mall shops doing the books. I beat her home by several hours. Enough time to set up the recording device and call a crosstown clinic to set up the DNA tests. Lila got home about 5 minutes after I completed my sleuthing chores. She had picked Sophie up from daycare on her way home. She was her normal loving self. She embraced me and kissed me. I pulled back from her because I did not want any intimacy with her. I was still boiling mad inside. She stopped and looked at me. What's wrong? Are you mad about something? No, I am just very tired tonight. I lied. Well then, why don't you go sit down and play with our beautiful daughter until I get dinner ready? Lila suggested. I was seething internally at this point. I thought, our beautiful daughter? Who was she kidding? As I sat in the family room with Sophie in my lap, I began studying her features really intently for the first time. Maybe something in the facial features would give me an indication of who the father is. I took note of her chin, nose, and eyes. Maybe I will see a guy with one or more of those features. In fact, I swore I knew someone who had the same upsweep on the nose and the same intense brown eyes. But from where? Somehow I made it through dinner and went to bed several hours before Lila did. I pretended sleep when she came to bed. She touched my shoulder, but I did not respond. She sighed and rolled over to sleep. Soon I could hear her deep breathing. I tossed and turned most of the night. I was still nagged by the lingering thought that I knew those eyes from somewhere. I became icy cold in my desire to find out who Sophie's father was and to punish both my cheating wife and the miserable a-hole that had fathered my supposed daughter. Morning came. At breakfast, I told Lila that I had the morning off and wanted to take Sophie to the park. She instantly agreed. The speed of that agreement gave me pause. Was she going to contact her lover while I am out with my supposed daughter? I drove Sophie and myself to the clinic where they swabbed our mouths for the DNA test. I then took Sophie to the park and made sure she had so much fun on the rides that hopefully the clinic had completely been forgotten. That evening, Lila said she had a meeting at church on some committee and would go with Betty and Brian. She left the house at 7 and walked next door to Betty and Brian's. As soon as Lila left, I got Sophie ready for bed, tucked her in, and went to the basement corner where I had installed the phone recorder. I removed the memory stick from the recorder and inserted a new one. I took the memory stick to my basement workbench. I had taken my laptop down and placed it on the bench earlier. With shaking hands, I clicked the play icon on the laptop screen. The first few conversations were normal household duties. Talking with the painting contractor, arranging for Sophie to join a ballet class, and stuff like that. The fifth conversation was between Lila and Betty. Betty said, "Hey kiddo, are you ready for tonight?" "Yes, I can hardly wait," Lila replied. "Well, I hope it takes this time. The last 4 times were sure duds. Brian is getting worn out too." "Brian's a good guy, and you are lucky to have him," Lila said. "Are you sure Evan suspects nothing?" Lila giggled. "Not a thing. He has no idea, and I want to keep it that way. No sweat. He didn't find out from us the last time, so he will not find out from us this time," Betty replied. "Okay, see you this evening." What the hell? Was Betty in on this also? She condoned Lila's cheating? Brian was also aware of it from the sound of it. In fact, it sounded like they were involved in setting up the illicit meetings with Lila and her lover. I had been so down the last few days, I had almost gone to Brian as my oldest and dearest friend for some advice. Now after hearing this conversation, I am glad I didn't. Of course, I had no idea who I could trust at this point. I was humiliated by the idea that my best friend and my wife's sister seemed to be part of the conspiracy against me. I was mad as hell at the idea that they condoned the whole affair. Well, for now, let them have their conniving fun. I needed more time to sort this whole thing out and to try to get some proof of the when, why, and who was involved. The DNA results took 3 days, then 2 more days for the results to be mailed to me at my office. On the 5th day, the clinic results arrived at my desk at work. I steeled myself and opened the envelope. It was as bad as I thought. Sophie could not possibly be my daughter. I dropped the report and cried into my hands for several long minutes. Getting a grip on myself, I called my supervisor and said I was not feeling well. I left for the day and drove to my neighborhood. I was surprised to see Brian's car parked in my driveway. The rear end of Lila's car was visible through the open garage door. I parked the car about halfway down the block and dialed my home number from my cell. Several rings went by before Lila picked up the phone. She should be able to tell from the caller ID that it was me calling from my cell. "Hi, hon. I'm really busy right now. Can I call you back in about 30 minutes? Lila sounded like she was out of breath. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" I asked. "Yes, I've got wallpaper striping gel all over the 3rd bedroom walls. I'm going to remove the paper and put up some new. I can't let the paper dry out right now." In the background, I heard a male voice whispering, "I can't let you dry out either, sweetheart. Get Evan off the line and let's get busy." I could tell that Lila stifled a giggle and after a moment's hesitation said, "Evan, I really have to run. Let me call you in half an hour, okay?" All I could say was okay. As I was about to hang up, I heard Lila voice, "Evan, make it an hour instead." "Thanks, hon." I sat in my car despairing over this fresh evidence. Brian's car was at my house. Lila was obviously entertaining somebody from the whispers and giggles I had heard. Could Brian be so crude as to actually bring Lila's lover to our house? Was she screwing him in our bed? Suddenly I thought even worse thoughts. Was Brian more involved in this than just being an instigator? Could he be a participant? This didn't seem possible because obviously Betty was aware of the whole thing Lila was doing. Betty certainly would not condone Brian screwing Lila. Geez, that was so sordid to even think that one sister would knowingly allow her husband to use another sister. But what is Brian's involvement? He obviously knew a lot about what was going on. Half an hour later, I was still in deep thought about all this when I saw Brian exit my house and get in his car. Fortunately, he went in the other direction and disappeared around the corner. What the hell? Where is the other guy? Is he still in there? How much screwing can Lila take in an afternoon? 10 minutes or so later, Lila came out the door and retrieved the mail from the mailbox. She wore a robe and her hair was wet like she just got out of the shower. Could it be Brian was doing her? I can't believe it. I must be wrong about all of this. But what other answer could there be? I was totally demoralized at this point. My best friends, my wife, my daughter are all a sham. I drive back to the Radio Shack and bought a sound-activated audio recorder. As I was driving to make this purchase, my cell phone rang. It was Lila. "Hi, hon, I'm done with the wallpaper for the day. I'm going to run and get a haircut and pick up Sophie. I'll bring some pizza home. I just don't feel like cooking tonight." All I could respond was, "Okay, see you at home later." I got back to the house and found the master bedroom bed devoid of sheets. Apparently they were in the washer that was still running. So the bitch and the a-hole are using our marital bed for their fornication? I thought. I placed the new recording device under the bed. It used the same memory sticks that the phone recorder used. I also replaced the memory stick in the phone recorder and took the stick with me when I left the house. I left the house and drove to the park. I placed the memory stick in the laptop and heard the first phone conversation my wife had of the day. It was with Brian. "Hi, Lila." "Hi, sweetie." Lila replied. "Is it safe to come over?" "Oh yes. Evan has left for work, and we have the whole morning to make a baby. Great. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Get good and hot for me. I'll start enjoying myself right now. Lila giggled. I heard the phone hang up. So Brian is doing Lila. I wonder what Betty will say about this. I'll bet she will be some kind of piss. Wait a minute. Based on the other conversations I've heard, Betty does know about this. What the hell is going on? My confusion was complete at this point. I stayed at the park until it was my normal time to come home from work. I arrived at the house and found my wife and supposed daughter making dinner and laughing about some cartoon that was on the kitchen TV. It saddened me to hear that laughter. It would soon be gone. One more piece of evidence and I would initiate divorce proceedings and sue whoever Sophie's father is for back and future child support. I will bide my time until then. I waited 4 days until the weekend to change the memory stick in the recorder under the bed. I waited until Lila went to the grocery store on Saturday. On at least one of the 4 days, the sheets on the bed smelled fresh and clean as if Lila had washed them again. I took the laptop and memory stick to the basement, plugged it in, and clicked on play. The conversation and sounds I heard tore my heart out. It was definitely Brian talking. It was definitely Lila panting and moaning, and then her voice carrying on a warm and loving conversation with Brian afterward. It was now clear. Her obvious wish was that Brian be the father of all of her children. Their conversation confirmed that Sophie was Brian's and not mine. This conversation sealed their fate. It would take me until Tuesday to prepare my revenge, but it would be worth the wait. On Monday, I briefed my attorney on the facts. He began divorce papers and certain other civil legal papers for delivery on Tuesday. I went to the bank, took out half of the funds, and opened new accounts in another bank. I canceled all of the credit cards. I informed Lila's car loan company that I would no longer be responsible for her debts. I wrote a check for $100,000 from the home equity line and put it in my new account. As of Monday night, I was financially cut from Lila and ensured she had half of our marital assets, just as my lawyer had told me to do. The recorder under the bed had indicated one more liaison between the cheating spouses had occurred on Monday. Then the phone recorder had indicated they planned to do it again on Tuesday. I picked up all of the papers from the attorney at 3 p.m. and drove to the park. I simply sat and stared straight ahead for over an hour. Yes, this was it. If I did not end it today, I don't think I could stand any more humiliation. I'd break apart and do something I would be sorry for. I drove home and sat in the kitchen waiting for Lila to arrive. The divorce papers were in my car, and I would get them as soon as Sophie was down for the evening. Lila bounced in at 5 p.m. with Sophie in tow and said, "Sophie, honey, go to your room and put your stuff away. I have to talk to Daddy for a minute." Sophie gave me a hug and a peck on the cheek and dutifully went to her room. Lila looked at me and smiled. She broke out laughing and gave me a hug. She said, "Evan, I have some wonderful news. We are going to be parents again." I went numb. I could not believe what I had just heard. Lila was trying to pass Brian's scumsucker off as mine again. Brian was going to enjoy all of the fringe benefits and leave me to raise his scumsuckers, and Lila was going along with it. It was obvious that she no longer loved me and probably hadn't for at least 9 months before Sophie was born. By God, I could not take any more humiliation. I jumped up and pushed Lila away from me with all of my strength. She hit the wall hard and slid down to the floor. Staring at me with wide eyes, she said, "Evan, what is wrong? Why did you do that? Aren't you happy about our new baby?" I started laughing hysterically. Our new baby? Our new baby? Who the hell are you trying to kid? You bitching 304. I know that scumsucker you're carrying is Brian's, and I know Sophie is not mine either. Did you think you could bitch your way through my life and leave me paying the bills for the scumsucker kids? Did you think I was so stupid that I would never find out? Lila had her head in hands rocking back and forth. "Evan, please let me explain. It is not what you..." "Shut up, you bitch. I've had enough of your lying. You've been lying to me for at least 4 years now. No more." Lila tried to rise and slipped back down. "How did you find out? We were so careful. I never wanted to hurt you or..." "What part of shut up didn't you understand? You're nothing more than a bitching 304. If it wasn't for the fact your kids are all scumsuckers, I'd take them away from you as an unfit mother." Lila recoiled in shock. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," Brian said. "Don't say his name again. Ever. Not in my presence. I want to know one thing. How many times have you two screwed?" "Hundreds probably." "Eh?" Lila shook her head and tried to respond between her sobs. "We only did it maybe 10 times. I didn't ask for an estimate, did I? How many times?" I screamed. "Okay, a dozen times in the last 4.5 years. Does that make you happy to know?" I saw red again. Brian was actually trying to push another one of his scumsuckers into my care and expense. Lila had been servicing him for almost half of my whole married life. Enough was enough. This man, this ex-friend of mine deserved a beating. I looked around and saw my baseball glove and bat next to the kitchen door. Cutting Lila off in mid-sentence, I rushed to the door and grabbed the bat. I looked at my watch. Brian should be pulling into his driveway any minute. I ran out of the back door heading to Brian's house. Lila was yelling at me from the doorway to please wait and let her try to explain and to please not to hurt Brian. All I heard was her saying Brian's name again. Don't hurt him? Hell, I want to kill him right now. That would feel good. She ran back in the house. I heard Brian and Betty's phone ringing as I neared their driveway hedge. Lila was trying to give them a warning that I was coming to get a piece of the a-hole. I saw Brian's car turn the corner, and he pulled in the driveway. Just then their phone stopped ringing. Betty must have answered it. Brian opened his car door and got out. I came out from behind the bushes. He saw me and smiled. Hey, Evan, how's it hanging? He suddenly froze when he saw my face. He knew that I knew. I raised the bat and ran at him. He tried to say something like, Evan, it is not what you think. I was just trying to, He never finished the sentence because I hit him with the bat as hard as I could. He had put up his right arm in an attempt to block the swing of the bat. The bat landed on his lower arm with a delicious sound of snapping bone. He wailed in agony. Dropping his broken arm, he tried to backpedal but was blocked by his own car. I swung the bat at his head and heard another delicious sound of bone breaking. He went down in a heap. About this time, Betty came running from their house yelling at me. Evan, please, let us explain. It is really not what you... She never finished because I caught her with the end of the bat right in her solar plexus. Down she went on the driveway, unable to breath. I stepped over top of Brian and positioned myself to swing the slugger between his legs. I hit his groin with the bat using all of my strength. I felt the bat impact him. He curled into the fetal position. Brian, you scumsucker. You screwed Lila at least a dozen times I know of. For that I am going to beat your baby-making equipment a dozen times. Let's make sure you never make a baby with anyone else's wife. I pulled his legs apart and swinging the bat one-handed as hard as I could, I hit him right in the balls. Over and over, 5 times. By the 6th or 7th time, he started bleeding a lot. By the 9th time, he threw up. I grabbed him by the shoulders and rolled him onto his side. You're not going to strangle on your own puke, you scumsucker. I'll not go to prison for killing you, even though I would like to send you to hell right now. Betty had struggled to her knees, but was still unable to speak due to lack of air. She was holding up one hand and beseeching me with her eyes to stop. She kept shaking her head no. About the 10th swing of the bat on good old Brian's gonads, Lila ran up. Evan, oh please stop. Don't hurt him anymore. Please, we all need to explain this mess to you. Can you please get a grip on yourself? Get a grip? You lying bitch. You get pregnant by this scumsucker not once but twice and try to pass the kids off as ours? And you want me to get a grip? Screw you. You probably have been screwed by half of the men in the county anyway. I'm sure you and your sister have both enjoyed sharing him. Lila could only shake her head at this outburst. She looked down at Brian and began crying again. So you feel sorry for this shithead, you 304? Let me show you what happens to cheating friends. With that I hammered Brian's 2 more times. Brian's crotch was now crimson and a pool of blood surrounded his hips on the ground. The seat of Brian's pants indicated that he had shit himself and pissed at least a pint. I looked from Lila to Betty. I hope you two got your fill of your joint lover, because he will never ever again service either one of you. He looks pretty sexy right now, doesn't he? All covered in blood and his own piss, shit, and vomit. He'll never screw anybody else with that equipment. I said as I threw down the bat in front of Lila. I heard you say how much you liked his baby maker balls, so take the bat. There are some pieces of what is left of his balls on the bat. You can treasure it forever. With that I walked slowly back to the house. I went upstairs to take a shower to get Brian's blood and shattered balls off me. I threw the clothes I had been wearing on the bathroom floor, showered, and went downstairs to pour myself a beer. I sat down at the kitchen table and drank my beer. I heard sirens and tires screeching to a stop next door. I heard both Betty's and Lila's voices shouting, and then later more screams again just before an ambulance pulled away with sirens blasting. They must be telling the authorities what a madman I was. Who gives a shit? Eventually 2 policemen entered the kitchen door with their guns drawn. The larger of the 2 pointed his gun at me and commanded me to drop to the ground and don't move. The other one cuffed me and read me my rights. They didn't say a word the entire way to the county jail. I never said a word about what happened. If the police asked me a question, I either answered yes or no. I did give them my name and address. Then I said no more as I asked for my attorney. What would tomorrow bring, I wonder? I suppose I will do time for assaulting Brian. I'm sure the women will concoct a story to explain my rage without giving up their joint lover. I was arraigned the next morning for assault and attempted murder. As I looked around the courtroom, I saw Lila and Betty sitting in the front row. They looked like they hadn't slept all night. I laughed to myself. Welcome to the club. I didn't sleep much last night either. My attorney pleaded me not guilty. He wanted me to consider pleading to temporary insanity as we near a trial. I told him I'd think about it because I knew had to be insane at the time I did Brian all of the physical damage. The judge sat my bail at $150,000. Lila and Betty whispered to each other and then nodded in agreement. They got up and left the room. I was taken back to detention while my lawyer tried to round up bail for me. I'd been in lockup for 4 days. All of my anger was gone. It was replaced with a cold, empty void of not feeling anything for anyone. My lawyer had said Lila had contacted him on the 3rd day and wished to meet with him. I told him fine, but don't commit me to anything. The lawyer shows up this morning and tells me that Betty and Lila wish to post my bail. Brian and Betty and her will drop all charges and refuse to testify if I will just meet and talk with them in Brian's hospital room. So if I will agree to the meeting, I can be out of jail by 3 p.m. and the meeting can be held at 5 p.m. I agree but wonder what kind of bullshit the 3 of them will try to sell me. I doubt if Brian will talk much since his jaw is wired shut from the blow I landed to the side of his head with the bat. Later, my lawyer escorted me from the jail at 3:30 and suggested we go to my house to grab a change of clothes and a shower. Lila had given him the key and guaranteed him that no one would be home to cause me any problems. I showered, shaved, and dressed in a comfortable pair of slacks and golf shirt. I went to my car and retrieved the audio recordings of the bedroom conversations and my divorce and lawsuit papers. These I placed in my laptop bag with my laptop. We arrived at the hospital just before 5 o'clock and went right to Brian's room. When we walked in, the hushed conversation that had been going on in the room ceased. Brian simply stared at me while the women tried to smile. There I stood at the doorway looking at my soon-to-be ex-wife, her immoral sister, and my once best friend. They looked back at me with sad eyes. I did not see any anger in any of them. I saw sadness. What the hell was this all about? Why are they sad? That I found out just what a pack of liars and cheats they are. There was dead silence for what seemed a long time. Finally, my lawyer cleared his throat and said, "You ladies asked for this meeting, so please explain why we are here." Lila rose from her chair next to Brian's bed. She looked ashamed and unsure how to start. Finally, she said, "Evan, we are so sorry. There was sex between Brian and me, but it was solely for making a baby. There wasn't and is no love between us. Betty knew about this whole thing, and it was even her idea. Please forgive us all for lying to you. We never intended for you to find out. We hoped you would go to your grave thinking Sophie and our new baby were yours. That was my hope and prayer." "Making a baby? What the hell are you talking about?" I asked. "Well, after 4 years it became apparent that with your low sperm count, we were never going to conceive a child. I was becoming desperate for a baby. I had many long soul-wrenching conversations with Betty about it. She was the one that came up with the idea that Brian was obviously a really fertile guy. Plus you and he have many of the same hair, eye and size features, so a baby by either of you could easily pass for the other's child. It took her a while to convince Brian that if he helped me conceive a child, our marriage would actually be stronger and more complete. She played on his deep feelings for you as his best friend, and he finally caved into the idea. So about 5 years ago, we started meeting for sex during my ovulation period. Betty allowed us to use their bedroom for these sessions. She was wonderful about it. After 6 attempts, I became pregnant with Sophie. Brian was really happy that he was going to be a father again, but understood he could never let you know that. Betty was happy that she had given us such a wonderful gift too. I wanted you and me to have a child. Evan and I did our best to accomplish it. The sex was simply to make a baby. It was not for enjoyment or love or lust. It was for our Sophie. Recently, I decided I wanted one more child, a boy if possible, so we conspired to create another baby. I'm so sorry that you found out and jumped to the wrong conclusions." "So the sex was just to make a baby?" I asked. "Yes. And you only did it until you knew you were pregnant?" "Oh yes." I looked at Betty. "And you knew about this and it was okay with you?" Betty smiled sadly and nodded her head. "We tried to give the ultimate gift to you too. I'm so sorry it was received so badly. We should have brought you in on it and hoped that you would understand. I can see why you were so upset." I looked hard at Betty and let out a sigh. "Betty, I am no longer upset about anything. After beating the crap out of Brian, I seem to have lost all my anger. I'm just sorry that you have been suckered into this too." Betty looked questioningly at me. "What do you mean?" "Betty, I have proof that this was more than sex to make a baby. Brian's eyes showed concern. Lila started crying again, and Betty looked at me curiously and asked, "What evidence?" Lila sobbed, "There is no evidence. I'm not like that. I did this for the children." Brian nodded his head in agreement with Lila. I shook my head and sadly replied to Lila, "No, Lila, you may have thought that, but an objective person hearing you two talk would think otherwise. It may have started that way, but it's not that way now. Is it?" "I don't know what you mean." Lila glared at me, now mad that her motives were being questioned. "All right, if you must prolong this farce, then let's just examine the evidence and ask a few simple questions. Your answers to these questions will determine the future for everyone in this room as well as the children's." I reached in my laptop bag, pulled out the laptop and the memory stick from the under the bed recorder. This conversation was taped in our bedroom the last time I know they screwed each other. It occurred a few days before the beating I gave Brian. This was the straw that broke my back forever. Afterward, I would never consider forgiving Lila or Brian. The first sounds we heard from the recording were almost animalistic grunts and moans. "My God, you get me hot, babe," as we heard Brian partially moan. "Me too, big boy. We certainly know how to turn each other on," Lila panted. You could hear them both laugh between inhalations of their breath. "It's a real shame that Evan's equipment is so defective. He could be enjoying your body." Brian laughed. "No way, my baby-making hunk. My body is now all yours. And always will be." Lila groaned. "Just do some more of that to me, please." Seconds later, the sound of a woman having an intense reaction was clearly heard on the recording. "My God, Brian, you sure know how to bring out emotion." Lila laughed. At this, I stopped the tape. Betty's eyes widened with each replay of the recording. "Lila, this conversation seems to suggest that you've been fully open to Brian whenever he wants and however he wants," I said. "Is that true? Yes or no?" "No. You have to understand. We became deeply emotional during these sessions and said things we didn't really mean. The heightened emotion just intensified the experience. That's all," Lila explained. Betty said, "I don't know. It sure sounded like you two had become true lovers." "I'm not happy with what I heard. I have to think about this some. And I guess the BJ was just to establish a higher level of responses from you two?" I asked innocently. "Absolutely," Lila replied. I punched the play button again and the voices returned. "Lila baby, get down there and do that super BJ that only you do. I've always loved getting it from you." Betty's eyes were now burning holes through her sister and Brian. The sounds of movement and then the sounds of their sex fest were heard. Seconds later, we hear Brian apparently finished. I turned the recording off again. "So Lila, I guess you two have figured out some new way for BJ to get you pregnant?" Lila just hung her head at this point. Betty walked over in front of Lila. She grabbed her sister by the shoulders and shook her. "I give you the greatest gift one sister can give another, and what do you do with it? You turn it into a dirty, sordid sex orgy." Betty released Lila and stepped back and then slapped her face with a full roundhouse right hand. Lila fell backward, and the impression of Betty's hand was clearly visible on Lila's cheek. "You lousy bitch," I interjected. "Now I am going to ask this once and only once. Did you screw around after you found out you had accomplished your baby-making goal?" Lila sobbed. "No, never." I sighed and flipped on the recording again. We heard Brian ask Lila, "When are you going to tell Evan that you were pregnant again? I'm glad we have been able to get together a couple of times since you found out. It has been nice to be with you, and know we have already made a baby." Lila sighed, "Probably on Tuesday, which will give us one more chance to be together." Betty sobbed and ran from the room at these last statements on the recording. I turned off the recording. "Well, Lila, apparently you did screw several times after you found out you were pregnant." Lila cried. "You don't understand. When two people make a wonder like a baby, you share some affection and bonding. But it was never intended to replace either you or Betty in our lives. We did it to feel close to each other for the wonderful thing we had." I stopped her. "You 304. You screwed this guy for sake of screwing him. Don't give me this bonding crap. Now, if you are finished with this meeting that you asked for, I would like you to at least be honest and faithful enough to stand by your agreement to drop the charges and refuse to testify against me." Brian and Lila nodded in agreement. I reached in the laptop bag and pulled out the divorce papers. Handing them to Lila, I said, "You were a good wife, but not an honest wife. You lied, cheated, and made me a cuck. You are hereby served with notice for divorce action on irreconcilable differences. If you contest it, you will hear this recording and others in court. You call it you 304. Lila's head sank as she took the papers. I also told her about the change in bank account status and credit cards. It seems that Betty and Brian had put up the bail, So Lila was not yet aware of the changes in her financial status. I turned to Brian. I handed him papers. A-hole, these papers indicate that I am suing you for back child support for your scumsucker kid. You will pay me $50,000 and establish a college trust for Sophie and this new scumsucker you have on the way. We will have the trust administered by Reverend Fuller, our church pastor, and you will tell him exactly why you have to provide the trust. I want our church members to know just what slime both you and Lila are. You will also acknowledge to Sophie that you are now her real daddy. Got it? Brian nodded as he looked down. I'm sure Betty is going to have a few more things for you to do, but that is between you and her. As far as Betty is concerned, I hope she can someday forgive you, Lila. I now have to run and pick up Sophie. I have to tell her that I am not her daddy anymore. Lila looked in near panic. No, please, don't do that. She is only 4. She will not understand. Can't we wait for a few years and then tell her? You just want to keep lying, don't you? You pathetic piece of trash. No, it stops now. I will tell her today and be done with it. Whether you two want to step up to your responsibilities and this is your business, not mine. I roared at her. With that, I left the hospital room and never looked back. Later, Brian tried to back out of our deal about not testifying and dropping the charges. I skipped out on the bail and did not show at my first court appearance. As soon as the judge had revoked bail and issued a bench warrant, I returned and served 3 months. Of course, Betty and Brian lost the money they had put up for my bail. Eventually, Brian dropped his charges and refused any further interaction with the DA's office. But his actions had cost him his wife. Betty divorced him within a year, his children, his home, half of his assets, and the future use of his sex organ. Things just never healed well. And as far as I know, Lila never saw him after that day in his hospital room. Years later, I'm now 38 and have been divorced from my ex-wife, Lila, for 7 years. I remember my life when I had left the meeting with my wife, Lila, her sister, Betty, and the a-hole brother-in-law, Brian. I had also discovered that Betty had been a willing participant in this farce and had actually been the one that came up with the idea that her husband should impregnate my wife since my sperm level was so low. After this whole ugly situation, I had started calling them the Three Musketeers. Actually, their name more aptly would be the Cucketeers. The Three Cucketeers had posted my bail after I had spent a few days in jail for beating up Brian. They had requested that I attend a meeting with the 3 of them in exchange for them posting bail and promising to both drop the charges and not assist the DA in developing a case against me. The meeting was to be in Brian's hospital room. Brian was recovering the beating I had given him. I had attended the meeting where I heard Lila's lame excuse that she was only using Brian to simply make babies and that she loved only me. She told me I was the only true father to our daughter and as yet unborn child. Betty had come unglued when I played an audio tape of Lila and Brian's last sexual encounter in my marital bed in my house. She had let Lila use Brian to conceive a child, but was enraged to find out that Lila and Brian apparently did more than just have sex to conceive a child, and that they continued to have sex after Lila was aware that she was pregnant. I had left the meeting after handing Lila divorce papers and Brian a lawsuit to recover my expenses for supporting Sophie since her birth. I left not only because I was disgusted with them, but also to tell Sophie as I had said I would. I went to the pre-K class to pick up Sophie and drove her home. While serving divorce papers on my wife had been tough, this conversation I was about to have with Sophie was going to break my heart. I asked Sophie to sit down at the kitchen table, and I served her a bowl of ice cream. She sat there, picking up small bites of ice cream in her spoon and licking the spoon clean. She looked at me with those big, innocent blue eyes and waited for me to say something. Why do the innocent ones have to suffer for mistakes of the guilty? I wondered to myself. I shook off the feeling and started in. Sophie, I have to talk to you about something very serious. I want to make sure you understand this whole thing, and I want you to know right up front that nothing I am going to tell you is in any way your fault. Okay. I managed to get out before I had to dry my eyes. Yes, Daddy, I understand. What's wrong? Where is Mommy? Sophie said, looking around. Mommy's with Aunt Betty and Uncle Brian. Mommy and Uncle Brian are the reason I need to talk to you. Honey, please stop eating your ice cream for a second and listen to me. I looked Sophie straight in the eyes and continued as she laid her spoon down. Your mommy decided a while back that Uncle Brian is your daddy. So from now on you are to call him Daddy. From now on, you call me Uncle Evan. Okay. Why Daddy? Well, sweetie, it's because Mommy made a decision that Uncle Brian, your new daddy Brian, was to be your real daddy. So I can only be your Uncle Evan from now on. This doesn't mean I love you any less. I will always be there for you, but not as your daddy. I had to stop at this point because my voice was cracking badly. But Daddy, I want you for my daddy. Sophie wailed. Sophie, That just can't be anymore. I'm not your real daddy. Brian is. Now please go upstairs and wash up. Sophie ran up the stairs in tears. I could hear her crying as she went to the bathroom to wash off the ice cream. Plus her tears. I was mentally destroyed. I had nothing in the way of emotions left. I was drained. I sat at the kitchen table just staring at the floor. I didn't even hear Lila's car pull in the driveway. She entered the house and saw me sitting at the table. She could tell by my beleaguered, defeated look that I had told Sophie that Brian was her father. Evan, how could you? She is only 4 years old. She can't possibly understand this whole thing. Lila cried. Lila, just shut up. You brought this on yourself. I've told Sophie that Brian is her father, and it was your decision. And by God, it was your decision the first time you slept with that a-hole. Oh, Evan, you just don't understand why I did what I did or how little Brian means to me. I guess I don't, and I really don't care to know at this time. All I know is your child is upstairs in tears, and there is nothing I can do to make it better. I suggest you go tend to Sophie's emotional needs, and I will go tend to mine. With that, I had left the house and never sat foot in it again. I heard from some friends that Betty had filed for divorce from Brian, and Brian had left the area. He was too embarrassed by the way our good reverend at the church had spread the reason that Brian was setting up trusts funds for Sophie and the yet unborn child. I also heard that Betty had told her parents why she was divorcing Brian, and that he and her own bitching 304 sister had caused the eventual betrayal. Betty and Lila's father soon forgave Betty, but refused to have anything to do with Lila. Their mother was at least civil to Lila, but stayed far away from her because of her husband's reactions. It came out that their mother took to the bottle to reduce the stress of dealing with her 2 daughters and her husband. She would occasionally sneak out of her house to do things for Lila when Lila needed help. She had to sneak because Father Dearest wanted no part of Lila or her wanton ways. Lila contacted me about 2 weeks after I had had my talk with Sophie. She said she wished to meet me at a local pub we used to frequent. She said she just had to explain herself to me and beg my Christian forgiveness. I was not a devout Christian, but I did believe in the Christian teachings. So I agreed to meet her and at least listen to her side of things. I walked in the pub about 2 p.m. It was very dark inside compared to the brilliant afternoon sun. It took me several moments to have my eyes adjust to see Lila sitting at our old favorite booth. She was wearing the bright yellow sundress that I had loved on her. I walked slowly to the booth and slid in opposite her. Okay, Lila, this is your meeting. I put up my hand and got the bartender's attention. I made a motion with my hand to show I wanted 2 fingers of Maker's Mark. He nodded and brought the drink to the table. Nice seeing you two again, he said as he set the drink down. Nice seeing you, Frank. I responded with a sad smile. He walked away, leaving us in stony silence. Lila finally said, Evan, I have to explain to you what you heard and why what you heard it is not really anything to be upset about. This farce was already irritating me. Let me see. You sleep with your sister's husband. You make 2 babies with him. You try to pass them off as mine. You tell him he is better than me, and you are all his. Have I left anything out? I'm sorry. I didn't mean for my opening remark to come out like that. I know I did wrong in your eyes. I know you feel betrayed. I know you heard things that seem to make things worse than they truly are. Please give me a chance to explain. Please. You have 10 minutes. Explain away, I said, glancing at my watch. Lila started. You know how much I wanted a baby. You know when we found out that your sperm level was so low, how devastated I was. I would have done anything to have a child. And you obviously did. I said dryly. Enough with the sarcasm, please. Give me my 10 minutes, eh? Lila snapped. Okay, you now have 9 minutes. Get on with it. I snapped back. I was so distraught over the situation that I cried on Betty's shoulder every day. I was so jealous of their apparent ease in having children. I used to tell her how wonderful it must be to have a virile man like Brian to make babies with. Lila said. Betty finally came to me and said she and Brian had decided to offer me the greatest gift in the world. Betty offered me the use of Brian to make a baby. Brian was not for it initially nor for a long time. Brian worried about his friendship with you. So Betty had to browbeat him into submission. Then it took me a while to agree with Betty's idea. Lila sighed. The first 2 times we tried to make a baby were very clinical. It was straight to the position with no kissing or fondling. Well, that obviously wasn't a problem later on from what I heard, was it? I snapped. No, it wasn't. Now shut up and let me explain. Lila snapped back. I had been reading everything there was to read on how to get pregnant. The doctor had given me a pamphlet that said that the sexually hotter a couple was in their sex, the better the chance of conception. I took that to heart. Lila went on. The next time Brian and I were together, I told him that he had to do everything he could to get me sexually aroused to my absolute limits. He just nodded and set to work. He tongue-kissed me, slowly undressed me, and basically aroused me to a height you and I had never achieved. When he finished, I knew it was the time. We did it one more time that day, and this time I did things to him to heighten his sexual responses, and he in turn heightened mine. I squirmed in my seat and only just managed not to leave as my loving wife told me her lover got her hotter than I ever had. Lila went on. I became pregnant with Sophie at that point. Brian and I met 2 more times after I knew I was pregnant. That was really not so much for sex as it was to celebrate that we had created a new life. The sex was just a byproduct. I thought that was the end of it after I gave birth to Sophie. You were the loving father I knew you would be. Brian was happy to be a proxy father. Betty was happy that she could help us. All was well. That was until I decided to have another baby. I looked at her and shook my head. You really thought I would accept being the sham father of 2 scumsucker children? You don't know me very well, do you? Lila smiled. Oh, dear one. I know you very well. I know you have high Christian values even if you don't go to church every Sunday. I just never expected you to find out. Anyway, when I decided to have another baby, Brian and Betty consented, but they did have reservations. I had to nag them for weeks to get them to consent. Brian started screwing me the very night that I talked to them about it. We used Brian and Betty's bed. We did it there the next 3 nights. I was fertile and did not want to miss an opportunity. I guess you heard Betty's telephone call to me about getting together for the 4th try. Brian and I had an extra aroused session that day. When I got home, I was still aroused. Do you remember that night when we had the best sex we ever had? Lila asked. My God. Yes, and it was great. I thought you were a wild woman. I reminisced. Suddenly it struck me. You mean you had been with Brian earlier that day and I was getting after that? Lila nodded, then quickly clarified. It wasn't like that. I cleaned up, and it was hours later when I essentially embraced you. I wouldn't do that to you. You let me hold your hand after Brian had touched it just hours before? I stammered, my voice tight with emotion. How could you think so little of me? I nearly yelled, my fists clenching in frustration. My love, I didn't mean to belittle you. I wanted to be close to you in every way possible that night. I loved you and wanted you to share the same intimate moments I experienced earlier that day. Lila's eyes filled with tears. None of this is coming out the way I meant it to. Again, I almost lost it and bolted. Instead, I clenched my jaws, ground my teeth, and kept my now white fists under the table to avoid making a terrible scene. Well, at least until the whole story was out. Lila then went on. It was several days later that I found out I was pregnant again. Brian and I met 2 more times to celebrate our creation. Then it was over. Lila tried to explain the audio tape content. As part of our sessions, Brian and I started talking trash to each other to stimulate an ever higher level of sexual response. That is what you heard on that audio tape you made. She just sat there staring at me, letting her words sink into my brain. Lila, you may call it celebration, but I call it screwing. You may call it sessions, but I call it cheating. You may still think that what you did is okay because you had good reasons, but it is not okay. Did you ever stop to think what might have happened if you and I had experimented and reached those heightened sexual responses? Although my sperm count is low, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe if we had had the chance to experience those same sexual heights you and Brian did, you might have gotten pregnant by me. Did you ever think of that? She looked away and sobbed. The marriage is over, Lila. I could never screw you again even if I wanted to. All I can think of is Brian getting there first. Goodbye. I started to get up but turned once more, leaned across and stared at her. You asked for my Christian forgiveness. I can't give you that. What I will do is forget I ever knew you. It may take years, but I will forget you. So go ask your God for forgiveness. You will get none here. With that, I stood up and left Lila sitting in our booth. She had her head down in her hands, shaking and crying as I left the pub. I took up residence at a small condo I could rent by the month. It was only a short walk to my office. So, I normally left the car in the driveway and walked to and from work. I was still stinging from the way Lila had seemingly thrown away our marriage. Did she really think I would never find out? Or maybe would not care when I did find out? One evening I was returning home from the office. I saw someone sitting on the front porch step at my condo. It was Lila. She looked very tired and wore no makeup. She had on an old set of jeans and a sweatshirt 3 sizes too big for her. She stood as I approached. Evan, can I talk with you for a minute? About what? Betty has renounced me as a sister. My own mother and father treat me like I am a leper. And most people at our church are treating me as an unclean heathen. I have no one to turn to right now. I know I don't deserve it in your eyes, but can I ask a favor? What about the a-hole Brian? Get him to help you. I roared at her. I can't. He has left town and will not be coming back here. Lila started crying. I need you. Whether you like it or not, you are Sophie's true father. Brian was only the vehicle I used to conceive Sophie. He isn't her father. You are. Can't you see that? No, and I never will. I shot back at her. I told you why you heard those things on the tape. You are wrong about a lot of things involving Brian and me. If you let me explain, I'm sure we can work this out and be happy again. She pled. You say I am wrong that you got pregnant by Brian? Not once but twice? And I am wrong you tried to pass the child off as mine. You certainly have balls, woman. I guess one of you should have balls, eh? I recalled the satisfaction I got in beating Brian's baby making equipment to a bloody pulp. Let me say this once 304. I do not ever want to talk again about your cheating. Never. I am slowly healing, and I certainly don't need you around opening up the wounds and scars again. Lila dropped her head and whispered, I'm sorry. I will not bring it up again. But I need some assistance with Sophie, and you are the only one I can turn to. What's wrong with Sophie? I asked. She has been a real handful since you told her you were not her daddy. She gets into fights with other children in her class. She rebels against any babysitter I try to use. She rebels so much that no one in the area will sit with her anymore. Lila confessed. Can you watch her for a few hours one day every few weeks? I know this is a lot to ask, but Sophie loves you, and I know you love her. Lila pleaded. What are you going to be doing while I am babysitting Sophie? Go out and get some more strange tool? I snapped at her. Lila sighed. I shouldn't even honor that question with an answer. I have to go to the doctor's office for a checkup for the new baby. And you want me to watch Sophie while you go get checked out for Brian's latest scumsucker child? You really do have balls, Lila. What gives you right to ask me to do such a thing? Lila dropped her head in defeat and turned to leave. I thought for a second and then yelled to her. Lila, I will watch Sophie because I do love her. This is for Sophie and not for you. Understood? Maybe I can help get her over this misbehaving she is doing. Lila turned and a hint of a smile played on her mouth. Thank you, Evan. You're still a good man at heart. I'm so sorry for what I've turned you into. 2 days later, Lila delivered Sophie for me to watch. Since I was so close to home from the office, it was easy to take a couple of hours off early and babysit. Sophie came running to my front door when I opened it and jumped in my arms. She hugged me and mumbled, "Oh, Daddy, I've missed you so much." I got her settled and talked with her about her acting so badly around other people. She looked at me and nodded her head and then said, "Daddy, can you come home now? I miss you." I almost cried. I touched her lips with my finger and said, "Sophie, you can't say that. I am not your daddy. Brian is. Remember our previous talk?" Sophie frowned and said, "But Mommy says that Uncle Brian was there only to get me born, but you are my real daddy. She says you are my real daddy in every way that really counts." I shook my head. "No, sweetie, that is not right. I am no more than an uncle to you. Your daddy is Brian." Sophie cried herself to sleep on my lap. Then I laid her on my couch and covered her up to stay warm. What kind of crap is Lila filling this child's head with? I wondered. No wonder the kid is acting up. She has got to be confused by all of the important people in her life, telling her conflicting things. When Lila returned from the doctor, I had a loud argument with her outside over what she was still telling Sophie. Lila, you still can't be honest, can you? Brian is Sophie's father, not me. So quit filling her head with nonsense that I am her father. Lila shook her head. Evan, you are Sophie's father in every way, shape, and form that is important for a little girl. She is your daughter even if you refuse to acknowledge her as such. Brian was just a convenient insemination method. I began to laugh. Give me a break. I heard you two whispering sweet nothings to each other. I heard you admit that you were screwing around even after the insemination. So don't give me that bullshit. This same scene was played out for the next 6 weeks straight. Sophie was still being told by her mother that I was her father. Sophie was getting more and more confused and hostile. I finally addressed the whole situation when Lila came to pick up Sophie on the 6th week. Lila, I can't watch Sophie anymore. This crap you're filling her head with about me being her father is just poisoning her and me. Get someone else to watch her because I just can't stand to see her being pulled apart like this anymore. Lila's eyes showed sadness I hadn't seen before. Okay, Evan, you win. I will tell her tonight that Brian is her father and you're not. Happy now? No, I'm not happy. But what has to be done has to be done. Maybe we can set up some more visits with me after the shock of you talking with her wears off. I still love? I don't think so. Lila stopped me. You either are in her life or you are not. I can't go on like this either. I'll get Mom to watch her. Don't do that, Lila. You know your mom is drinking way too much these days. I don't trust her to watch a small child. I said. She just looked at me, turned and walked away. With that, she took Sophie home, and that was the last time I saw Sophie with her mom. You see, the next week, Lila had her mother watch Sophie since no one else would. Lila had a late-day appointment with her OBGYN. She was not carrying the fetus well due to the stress of lack of sleep, emotional trauma, and not eating properly. She had asked her mother to pick Sophie up at pre-K and sit with her at my former home. As I mentioned earlier, her mom had apparently taken to alcohol caused by Lila and Betty's falling out. Her mom was drunk when she picked Sophie up. She drove right through a red light and was hit by an 18-wheel truck. Her mom died instantly. Sophie lingered in a coma for 23 weeks. I went to see Sophie almost every day. I held her hand, read her favorite stories to her, and brushed her hair. I was her daddy for those 23 weeks. The day of the accident, Lila collapsed and sobbed uncontrollably. As Sophie continued in her coma, Lila began to mentally collapse. Her own father refused to see her or have any contact with her. He ranted that Lila was responsible for the loss of his wife and the life-threatening injuries to his granddaughter. He shot himself 2 months after his wife's funeral. He left a note accusing Lila of being the single reason he was so depressed. On top of all that, Betty had never forgiven Lila for her role in taking away their mother and father as well as breaking up her own family. That was final straw that broke Lila's fragile mental state. Lila was committed to a psychiatric institution within a month. Sophie woke up almost 23 weeks to the day after her accident. She looked around and her eyes tried to focus on me. She asked very quietly, "Daddy? Is that you, Daddy?" I grabbed her hand and replied, "Yes, sweetie. It's Daddy." I'd come to realize as I'd watched Sophie fight for her life that I was her daddy. She loved me unconditionally and I her. She was my daughter, and I would treasure her forever. Over the next 3 months of her gradual recovery, I told her these things and more. I told her how wrong I'd been in telling her I wasn't her daddy. I told her I'd been very sick when I said those things and was so sorry I'd made her feel so bad. I told her how much I loved her. She smiled each time I said these things. She would reach up and grab my neck and hug me close to her. We were father and daughter again, hopefully forever. Lila and Brian's baby, a boy, was born, but Lila never even realized what was happening. She was mentally living somewhere else, in another time and place. When Betty accepted custody, she had named the baby Evan Brian Carter. Obviously, Betty had kept her sense of humor by naming the baby after me and her ex-husband. Or she was still very angry at Lila. 3 years later, the child was blood tested prior to pre-K enrollment. Guess what? His blood type is AB. Apparently that one night that Lila had brought me to the sexual heights she had enjoyed with Brian was enough to make my little sparse swimmers into supermen. Too bad Lila will never know it. Early on she was in and out of reality with no real pattern. Lately, however, the Institute says she recedes further from reality with every waking moment. I wonder what she dreams about every day. I wonder if she is dreaming of our life together or her times with Brian. Betty has ensured that Evan is a big part of his Uncle Evan's life. I thank her for that. We started taking Evan and Sophie to dinner together once or twice a week. Through the years, I have come to conclude that Betty is basically a good woman, and Sophie loves being around her Auntie Betty. At the moment, I've no real feelings for Betty one way or the other, but we are comfortable together. Sophie loves Evan, and Evan adores Sophie. I've openly forgiven Betty for her part in the whole sad situation. She was trying to do something good for her sister and for me. I'd finally healed my emotional wounds. I'd done what I could to make sure Sophie remembered her mother in a positive light, but I now had a good woman in my life that Sophie adored. All was well with the world, until that day. That day, when I received the call from the Institute telling me Lila was awake and alert. Oh God, now what? Will this nightmare never end? Now let's listen Lila's side of story. I remember when Evan had found out that my sister's husband, Brian, was the true father of our little girl and our yet unborn baby. He had become a totally unglued, seething mad creature and badly beaten Brian, almost to death. I'll start my story from the time when my sister, Betty, made the suggestion that eventually led to the destruction of both our families and marriages. I'll probably be repeating some things Evan said in his earlier words, but please, hang in there with me as I try to explain my side of those events. I'll try to keep the rehashing of these events short, but you have to understand how those events led to the point where I finally lost my mind. Evan and I had been married for 5 years. Try as we might, I couldn't get pregnant. We tried all kinds of procedures, but when all was said and done, we couldn't have children. The problem was that Evan's sperm was very weak. Not non-existent, but just too weak to actually fertilize my eggs. After 2 rounds of failed in vitro that were very expensive, I was desperate for a baby. I dumped all of my grief on my sister for months. I so much wanted a child and was actually jealous of how easy it appeared for her and Brian to conceive their 2 children. She listened patiently and gave me what support she could. Finally, one day she dropped the suggestion that would solve everything, then eventually be our undoing. Betty was making soup as I ranted about how unfair life was. She suddenly stopped and came over to where I sat at her kitchen table. She dropped down in the chair next to me and grabbed my hands with hers. "Sis, I've been thinking. I want to offer up a possible solution. Hear me out before you say anything. Okay?" Betty said. I just nodded in response and she continued. "You know that Brian is very fertile. He loves you and Evan as much as I do. He looks a little like Evan." Betty stopped and took a deep breath and said, "Here's what I suggest. Brian can be a surrogate father for your baby. Evan need never know. You can have the baby you so desperately want, have Evan as a loving father and husband, and have an even more solid marriage." I shook my head. "No, Evan would never go along with it." Betty replied, "He wouldn't have to know." "How would he not know? The cost of doing in vitro is $20,000. Health insurance doesn't pick any of it up. How could I hide that amount from him?" Betty answered with a small grin playing at the corners of her mouth. "Who said anything about in vitro? I'm suggesting that you get pregnant the old-fashioned way. Brian is actually a very good lover." I was shocked and said, "So? You are suggesting that Brian, your husband, and I start screwing? Have you lost your mind?" Betty laughed and shook her head. "No, I'm not daft. I just can't think of any way to hide this whole thing from Evan without you and my husband doing the nasty. You're so close to complete breakdown over being childless. I'm just trying to solve the problem in the most practical way possible. If you and my husband simply screw to conceive a child, I can live with it. After all, it is not like an affair or you two loving each other. Evan need not know. So, no harm, no foul." "I can't do that." I snapped back at her. "Well, sis, just think about it." I went home and tried to continue my life as before, but Betty's words kept intruding my thoughts. "You simply screw to conceive a child. No harm, no foul." After a few more months, I was beyond hope. I walked slowly to Betty's house and plopped in the kitchen chair. "Okay, sis, I want a baby. I need a baby. So, how do we pull this off?" Betty came over and hugged me. "Good girl. Now you let me convince Brian, and then we will set up the logistics of this whole thing. You'll be barefoot and pregnant in no time." Betty was true to her word. She had to convince Brian to do it. At first he rebelled and even refused to discuss it. Betty wore him down until he finally saw that what she was asking him to do would help my marriage and my mental health. He talked with Evan and found out how desperate Evan was for me to be pregnant. He saw that Evan would be so happy to be a dad. Brian finally told Betty, "Okay, sweetheart, if you want me to give Lila a baby, I will." Betty called me and let me know Brian was on board. Betty suggested that I come over to her place on the first night I was sure I was ovulating. That happened to be 2 nights later. I arrived at her house about 10 in the morning. Brian had taken the morning off at Betty's request. Betty met me at the door and said, "Brian is upstairs in the guest room. Go on up there. And don't come down until you're pregnant." She hugged me and pushed me toward the stairs. I entered the bedroom and saw Brian lying fully dressed on the bed, reading a magazine. He looked up as I entered and smiled. I smiled back and sat down on the edge of the bed. "So, what do we do now, Brian?" He laughed out loud and replied, sounding somewhat embarrassed, "Well, I guess we get naked, Lila." And so we did. He was first out of his clothes, and he laid down on the bed just watching me undress. His breathing seemed to become faster as I slipped out of my clothes. "Lila, you are one beautiful woman. Not as beautiful as your sister, but damned close." I was more than a little embarrassed. Other than Evan, I'd never even seen another. Brian seemed as embarrassed as I was. He cleared his throat a few times and said, "Come here, Lila. We might as well get acquainted." I slid into bed, and he wrapped his arms around me. For a few moments, we simply held each other in silence. Slowly, I traced my hand down his stomach to his lower body. To put it briefly, we had an intimate night and tried everything to conceive. The whole process was over in less than 15 minutes. We dressed in silence and came downstairs to find Betty quietly sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of scotch in her hand. She smiled and said, "I know this was my idea, but it is a little tough to actually know it has happened." I burst into tears thinking of her pain, and Brian ran over to her and hugged her. They both had tears in their eyes. Brian said, "Not again." "Okay, I can't do this again." Betty pushed Brian back with her hands. While holding his shoulders, she stared into his eyes and smiled. "Brian, I love you to death. This was my idea, remember? Until Lila is pregnant, we continue. We'll be fine, my dear sweet man. Brian just nodded dumbly and looked down at the floor. Betty and I exchanged glances, and she winked at me. I nodded my head and turned and left their house. I almost died when Evan got home from work that evening. I just knew he would know that I cheated on him. Well, maybe not cheating in the classic idea of cheating, but cheating nonetheless. I did my best to act normal and loving as always. In fact, it was not an act. I loved this man to my very depths. He was my rock. What I did today, I did for both of us. Well, maybe more for me than him, but still for both of us. As the night progressed, he apparently saw nothing amiss and I began to relax. We made love later that night, and we wished each other a good night. We fell asleep in each other's arms. He didn't know. He would never know. We could make this work. I fell asleep with visions of holding a baby in my arms and Evan standing behind me looking lovingly at our baby while he kissed the back of my neck. The next day, I went back to Betty's and replayed yesterday's events. I dressed and left the house. Betty had gone to the supermarket while her husband tried to impregnate me. I had been reading books on getting pregnant, and one doctor had an approach that required both partners to get as hot as they could during lovemaking. His statistics showed that a woman stood a 30% better chance of pregnancy if she was actually quivering from the lovemaking when her partner does it. The doctor also indicated the partners were more at ease when they were so aroused. I was getting comfortable with Brian after our second session and saw no reason that being aroused wouldn't be acceptable. This would be acceptable just as long as we didn't start falling for each other or diminish our love for our spouses. I brought the book in my purse to the next session with Brian the next day. As we lay in bed, I had him read it and then said, "Do you think you can make me excited? I mean boiling hot? It may make me conceive quicker." Brian just smiled and said, "I was going to suggest something similar. I'm having a hard time staying excited with the way we have been so clinical about this." I smiled and said, "You're having a hard time staying focused? Well, I'll make sure that won't be an issue today." With that, we did everything to reach the peak of our excitement. Once we were done, he leaned in, and we shared another kiss. This time, it was deeper and more meaningful. In that moment, I knew we were going to spend more time together before parting ways, and I wanted to feel that passion again, to share something genuine with him. I returned his kiss, feeling a sense of warmth and understanding between us. He smiled and, playfully touching my right shoulder, said, "That was amazing. I've never felt so connected. You're a great companion." As soon as he said companion, I felt a sudden chill. "Brian, we're working on a mission. I'm not your companion, nor will I ever be. Please, don't say that again." Brian looked both saddened and confused. Oh, I'm sorry, Lila. I was so carried away by the mind-blowing sex that I kind of forgot what this is all about. I'm sorry." As I struggled with my clothes, I just nodded at him and said, "No problem. But remember what this is all about. Conceiving a baby, nothing more." I ran home, cleaned up, and waited to fall into Evan's arms. When he came in, I did just that, and dinner was several hours late that night. I felt so guilty about what we three conspirators were doing behind his back, but it was for a good cause. I didn't get pregnant that month, so I was forced to wait for ovulation the next month. Neither Brian nor Betty said a word about the events of those first 3 days during the entire waiting period. The next month's ovulation arrived and I found myself in Betty's bedroom with Brian. Brian's mother had come to visit them and was using the guest room. We had no choice but to use their marital bed for our sessions. Betty had maneuvered Brian's mom to an afternoon of shopping, while her husband and I brought each other to wave after wave of sexual heights. By the third day of our time together, I was looking forward to spending it with Brian. He was a wonderful partner and seemed to have endless energy. We began exploring new experiences together, trying things I had never considered before. Brian had rented a couple of films to enhance our sessions, and we started incorporating some of the things we saw into our own activities. Between us, it felt like two people rediscovering intimacy, much like teenagers exploring their first encounters. In one of our sessions, I gently explored his boundaries. He eventually finished and I instinctively knew that we had succeeded. 1 week later, the home pregnancy test confirmed it, positive. I ran next door to Betty and fell into her arms. "Oh, Betty, we did it. I'm pregnant. I can't thank you enough. I can't thank Brian enough. Where is he? I have to tell him." Betty was bursting with joy. Her gift had been successful, and she giggled like a silly young girl. "Oh, Lila, it's wonderful. Brian will be so pleased. He's at the office. Do you want to call him?" "No. I think I'll just go down to his office and break the news to him. Then I can go to Evan's office and tell him." I smiled as she thought of the happy afternoon ahead. Betty just smiled and nodded. I ran home and grabbed my purse and headed for Brian's office. I hummed the entire drive downtown. The main parking lot was full, so I pulled into the Marriott Hotel lot next to Brian's office building. I felt a little naughty and thought Brian might get a kick out of holding the mother-to-be of his baby in his arms. But he certainly couldn't do that in his office. It would cause too many questions. I made a split-second decision and went into the Marriott. I booked a room and then went to Brian's office. I had his secretary announce me, and I swept into his office. He looked up somewhat startled to see me. Seeing how radiant I appeared, he asked, "It's happened, hasn't it?" I just grinned and crooked my little finger at him. I said, "Follow me. Tell your secretary you have an appointment. I'll wait in the Marriott lobby." He got up and grabbed his coat and gave me a full 5-minute head start. I waited for him as promised, and shortly after he swept through the hotel's front door. I walked up to him and simply said, "Room 1256. I walked past him to the first open elevator and pushed up. Just as the door was about to close, a hand reached in and pushed it open. Brian jumped aboard and seemed to be beaming. He pulled me to him and kissed me. He pulled back and looked level into my eyes. "It's true? You're pregnant?" "Yes, I'm pregnant. I'm carrying your baby. Our baby." I all but cried as I held tightly to his neck and covered his face in kisses. We fell through the door into the room and immediately screwing like two rabbits, our clothes littering the floor. It wasn't that I loved him. I adored him for what he had given me, and we did do things to each other that we never attempted with our spouses, but I didn't love him. We had just made something wonderful together, and I wanted us to enjoy it and each other at least one more time as we celebrated our accomplishment. Later that afternoon, I showered and dressed, and then watched Brian do the same. We held each other and kissed deeply one more time. I thought this would be the last time we would be together, and I was almost sorry it was over. Brian just looked deep into my eyes, patted my butt, waved, and walked out the door. I smiled and waved back. A few minutes later, I left the hotel and drove to Evan's office about 3 miles away. I whispered the news to his secretary, and she announced me by saying, "Evan, there's someone out here you must see. I'll send her in." She smiled broadly as she waved me into Evan's office. I swept through the door and danced over to his desk. He rose looking confused. "Lila, what's wrong?" "Nothing, my dearest darling husband. Nothing at all." I reached out and pulled him to me and kissed him. "What is it, Lila?" "Oh, nothing much. It's just you're going to be a daddy. I thought you should know, and we should go celeb," Evan yelled, interrupting my little speech. "Pregnant? Are you sure?" Evan questioned. "Yes, my darling. We are having a baby." I chuckled at Evan's confused expression. Evan's face broke into a huge smile. "A baby? My God, finally. It's a miracle. I love you." He embraced me in a big hug. For the next 9 months, life was wonderful. Evan was the typical doting father-to-be, and I was in heaven. Even the morning sickness was welcomed. The only thing was I sometimes got nostalgic for the baby's father, Brian. 2 weeks after I had made my announcement to Evan, he had to leave town for a 2-day business trip to Atlanta. I helped him pack and sent him off as he kissed me and rubbed my stomach with his big, innocent grin. That night, I had just finished talking with Evan. He had called to say he had arrived safely and missed my surprise package, and me, as he put it. I told him I missed him too, and we wished each other a good night's sleep and lots of love and hung up. The phone rang almost immediately, and I thought it was Evan calling again to tell me something he forgot. I answered, "Hey, baby." I heard Brian's voice reply, "Hey to you to baby." I was surprised. "Brian, what do you want?" He was blunt. "Lila, I need one more night with you. After what we have done together, and what we have done to each other accomplishing it, I just can't stop cold turkey like we have. Can we celebrate together just once more?" "Brian, I can't. I'd love to, but I can't. Having you get me pregnant is one thing, but screwing you after I knew I was pregnant is something else. It feels like cheating." "It's not, Lila. I'm the baby's father. Damn it. I'm not an unfeeling scumsucker. I'm a man with feelings. I need to end this on terms that I can live with. And just stopping cold turkey left me hanging with emotions I don't know how to deal with. I helped you. Now, can you help me?" I thought for a moment. I, too, had some unresolved emotions involving Brian that needed to be dealt with. As the baby's father, he did have some emotions that Betty and I had caused. He would never have felt this bad if it hadn't been for us. I finally replied, "Okay, Brian, where can we meet?" "When?" Brian said, "I'll be at your house at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Betty is getting an afternoon and sleepover at the Canyon Ranch Spa. I bought it for her yesterday when I heard Evan was going to be away on a business trip." I felt a tingle go through my body. Brian was sending Betty away for the afternoon and night so he could be with me. I thought, we're going to screw again. Oh shit, I've got to stop it. Tomorrow, is it? No more. Tomorrow we celebrate our baby for the last time. And so we did, and so it was. I did things with Brian that day that I was totally embarrassed about. He made me do things that made me so hot I was ready to be screwed by anybody that happened to be around. Lucky for Brian, he was the only one around. We did our screwing in Evan's and my bed. Actually, we screwed all over the bedroom. We also did it in the kitchen, family room, living room, and over the dining room table. This was when we started pushing boundaries with our conversation. Brian began with playful comments like, "Lila, I love that fiery side of you. Tell me it's all mine." As he teased me, I responded with things like, "Yes, baby. This side belongs to you now. I'll always think of you when I'm with Evan." The conversation quickly became more intense from there. None of it was meant seriously, just playful banter. I'm sure Brian didn't mean a word of it either, but it fueled a fiery passion between us. We could never speak like this with our partners. They would think we were crossing lines. But with each other, we embraced this freedom, saying and doing things of a passionate nature. And we did, over and over, throughout the evening. Eventually, he had to leave to get home to his family. By the time Brian had me, I knew we had passed a hidden line of some kind. We both knew we would not do this again. But we both knew we had loved doing it to each other. Saying those wicked things and doing sexual acts we never could ask our spouses to do would forever be our secret. I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Sophie. She did look like Evan and me. Of course, she really had a bit of Brian's features, but they were close enough to pass for Evan's. Brian would watch her from afar and feel pride at the wonderful daughter he could never admit having. By the look on his face, I sensed that he sometimes wished he could shove this knowledge down Evan's throat when Evan boasted about something Sophie had done. But he would look at Betty and me and just laugh at the story Evan was telling. I worried for a while, but as time went by, things smoothed into a normal routine and all was well. It was several years later that I decided Sophie needed a brother or sister, so I hesitantly approached Betty about it. She said she needed to think about it for a while. That afternoon she called and asked me to come over for some coffee. Once we were seated, she said, "Okay, Lila, this is the last time. I felt very uncomfortable with Brian's relationship with me for a few months after you got pregnant last time. I was afraid you two had real feelings for each other, but I appear to be wrong soon thereafter. I guess Brian just had a hard time dealing with all of it. I am a little concerned, but I guess it's okay with me if it is with him. He gets home early tonight so we can find out then. Just wait with me, and we can talk sister stuff until then." Brian showed up about 45 minutes before Evan was due home. When he walked in, I just stood up and announced, "Brian, I want another baby. Can you? Will you father another child for me? For us?" Brian looked floored. He stammered, "What? Again? Jesus, I don't know. I had a real hard time getting over last time. Seeing my daughter living so close and not be able to hold her or be the dad that I know I am has been tough. I don't know if I can go through it again. Let me sleep in it. Let me have some time to think this over. Please?" Betty and I could say nothing except that he should do what he thought was right. 2 days went by. Evan had just left for work when there was a knock on the door. I opened it, and there stood Betty and Brian. I let them in, and after settling in the living room, I awaited one of them to say something. I couldn't help but notice that Betty was sitting in the exact spot on the couch where Brian had screwed me years ago when we had met for the last time. Brian cleared his throat and said, "Okay, Lila, I'll make a baby for you one last time. This is it. No more after this." Betty nodded without looking overly happy about it. She said, "Lila, this is Brian's decision. I'm not real happy about this second child, but it was my idea originally, and I guess one more time will not cause any more damage than last time. At least I hope not." With that, we fell to arranging the liaison dates. My most fertile period was in 1 week. Brian agreed to start then. We would meet at our house during the day while Evan was at work. Betty felt more comfortable this time with us doing it at my house instead of hers. True to form, Brian arrived right on time, and we fell into bed. Immediately, we took up where we had ended it. We talked trash to each other. We did things that we would never do with our spouses. I was still so hot from that session with Brian that when Evan got home, I literally attacked him and we had the hottest sex we ever had for most of the night. It was so much better than with Brian. Not only was it hot, it was with love. Nothing could surpass that night. I checked the test strips 1 week after our last session. Sure enough, I was pregnant again. It had only taken 3 times to ensure my belly would swell with new life again. Over the next few days, I planned out some things. First, Brian and I would get together a few more times just like last time, just so we could both ease out of the intense sexual relationship we had developed. Brian set up a friend at a radio station to announce to Betty she had one 3-night stay at Canyon Ranch Spa. Actually, Brian had bought the 3-night package for Betty, so we could get her out of the picture while we weaned ourselves from each other's sexual grasp. We met all 3 days while Betty was away. On the first day, we talked our normal trash to each other. "My God, you get me hot, babe," Brian partially moaned. "Me too, big boy. We certainly know how to turn each other on," I panted. We both laughed between inhalations of our breath. "It's a real shame that Evan's equipment is so defective. He could be enjoying hot body of yours." Brian laughed. "No way, my baby-making hunk. I am now all yours. And always will be." I groaned. "Just do some more." Seconds later, I experienced a very intense moment and let out a surprised gasp. "My God, Brian, you sure know how to cook dinner." I laughed. That first afternoon, we spent time together in several different places. Our lively conversations continued, with playful moments shared along the way. This bullshit continued as we tried to make each other hotter and hotter. Each time we came down from an erotic high, we knew it was one less time before we parted ways again. Brian asked me, "When are you going to tell Evan that you were pregnant again? I'm glad we have been able to get together a couple of times since you found out. It has been nice to be with you, and know we have made a baby." I sighed. "Probably on Tuesday, which will give us one more chance to be together." The next morning, I decided on how to surprise Evan with my news. I'd tell him when he got home tonight. Then tomorrow with Brian would end it. From then on, it would just be Evan and our babies. Yes, that would be the way it would be. That night, I bounced in at 5 p.m. with Sophie in tow and said, "Sophie, honey, go to your room and put your stuff away. I have to talk to Daddy for a minute." Sophie gave each of us a hug and ran upstairs. I said to Evan, "Evan, I have some wonderful news. We are going to be parents again." Evan jumped up and pushed me away with all of his strength. I hit the wall hard and slid down to the floor. I stared at Evan and wailed, "Evan, what is wrong? Why did you do that? Aren't you happy about our new baby?" Evan started laughing hysterically. "Our new baby? Our new baby? Who the hell are you trying to kid? You bitching bitch. I know that scumsucker you're carrying is Brian's. And I know Sophie is not mine either. Did you think you could 3-0 for your way through life and leave me paying the bills for the scumsucker kids? Did you think I was so stupid that I would never find out?" I had my head in my hands rocking back and forth. "Evan, please let me explain. It's not what you—" "Shut up, you bitch. I've had enough of your lying. You've been lying to me for at least 4 years now. No more." I tried to rise and slipped back down. "How did you find out? We were so careful. I never wanted to hurt you or—" "What part of shut up didn't you understand? You're nothing more than a bitching 304. If it wasn't for the fact your kids are all scumsuckers, I'd take them away from you as an unfit mother." I recoiled in shock. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," Brian said. "Don't say his name again. Ever. Not in my presence. I want to know one thing. How many times have you two screwed?" "Hundreds probably." "Eh?" I shook my head and tried to respond between sobs. "We only did it maybe 10 times. I didn't ask for an estimate, did I? How many times?" Evan screamed. "Okay, a dozen times in the last 4.5 years. Does that make you happy to know?" Evan jumped up and looked around and grabbed his baseball bat. He headed out the door. I yelled at him, "Evan, please, wait. I can explain all of this. It's not what you think. Brian and I are not lovers. Please wait." But it was too late. Evan stood in the driveway waiting for Brian to arrive. I yelled again, "Evan, don't hurt him. He's nothing. He means nothing. He was just a means to an end. Don't hurt him." Evan turned and looked at me as if I was some crazy person. I ran back in the house and dialed Betty's number. She answered. "Hello? Betty, Evan knows. He's going to hurt Brian. Call Brian and tell him not to come home yet. Maybe we can calm Evan down." Betty was taken back. "Evan knows? How? It's been over for weeks. How did he find out?" I couldn't tell my sister that her husband and I were still meeting to taper off each other. I just yelled, "No time now. Evan will kill him if he shows up." With that, I hung hoping she could contact Brian before it was too late. But just then I heard Brian's car come in the driveway. Too late. Oh God, too late. I ran to the door just in time to see Evan lay into Brian. I heard Brian's arm snap as the bat hit it. Then the sickening thud and crack of Brian's jaw breaking under the attack of Evan's bat. I saw Betty run out and try to stop Evan. I saw Evan poke the end of the bat into Betty's solar plexus and Betty went down gasping for air. Contrary to other reports, Evan never hit Betty with the bat. I stood frozen as Evan began pounding Brian's groin with the bat. Betty had made her way up to a sitting position. I ran out yelling for Evan to stop. "Evan, oh please stop. Don't hurt him anymore. Please, we all need to explain this mess to you. Can you please get a grip on yourself?" Evan looked at me in some sort of crazed face and yelled back at me, "Get a grip? You lying bitch. You get pregnant by this scumsucker not once but twice and try to pass the kids off as mine? And you want me to get a grip? Screw you. You probably have been screwed by half of the men in this county anyway. I'm sure you and your sister have both enjoyed sharing him. At this point I knew all was lost. He was completely out of control. I thought he would kill Brian, and all I could do was break into tears. Evan looked at me and yelled, "So you feel sorry for this shithead, you 304? Let me show you what happens to cheating friends." With that he hammered Brian's 2 more times. Brian's tools was now crimson and a pool of blood surrounded his hips on the ground. The seat of Brian's pants indicated that he had voided himself and pissed his pants. Evan looked from me to Betty. "I hope you two got yours of your joint lover, because he will never ever again service either one of you. He looks pretty sexy right now, doesn't he? All covered in blood plus piss, shit, and vomit. He'll never screw anybody else with that equipment," he said as he threw down the bat in front of me. "I heard you say how much you liked his baby maker balls, so take the bat. There are some pieces of what is left of those balls on the bat. You can treasure it forever." With that he walked slowly back to the house. He heard me say how much I liked Brian's balls. Where had he heard that? I couldn't take any time to try to work that out. A neighbor must have seen what was happening and called the cops. I heard sirens approaching. The cops pulled up in a matter of seconds and jumped out demanding to know what was going on. They saw Brian on the ground and called for the EMT. Betty was next to Brian, trying to comfort him, oblivious to all around her. The cops asked me what had happened. I was in shock and couldn't speak. All I could do was moan and rock back and forth as I saw my marriage disappear. The police finally pieced together the story and, with weapons drawn, went to our house to subdue my crazed husband. I sobbed as I watched them haul Evan off. He never looked right or left. He simply stared straight ahead and ignored the still grisly scene with Brian's blood and testicles spattered all over the driveway. I was totally lost at this point. My Evan hated me for what I had done. He had done serious bodily injury to Brian. Betty was hysterical at what had happened. I made arrangements for my parents to watch Sophie for the next couple of days. I simply told them that Evan had seemed to have a nervous breakdown and he had hurt my brother-in-law. It was easier to lie to them than to tell them the truth. The truth that their daughter was putting out to their son-in-law and had been caught. I slept at Betty's that night as we tried to comfort each other in our miseries. I had managed to contact Evan's attorney and find out that he would be kept overnight in county jail and arraigned in the morning. First thing in the morning, Betty and I went to the hospital and were allowed to see Brian. His face was a mess and tubes hung everywhere. The doctor told Betty that he might never be able to have sex again because of his severe groin injuries. We cried together. She cried for the devastating injuries to her husband, and I for being the cause of those injuries. We left the hospital when Brian fell into a drug-induced sleep and headed for the courthouse. We found the right courtroom and waited for Evan's arraignment. He was finally led into court. He looked awful. He glanced up and saw me and made no sign of recognition. His lawyer pled him not guilty, and the judge set his bail at $150,000. Where would I get that much money? I needed Evan out of jail so I could attempt to smooth over the problems. Betty leaned over and whispered to me, "We can put our business up as collateral for the bail. I'm as much to blame for this mess as you are. Evan can't rot in jail for something we planned and kept secret from him." I nodded my head and looked up to see Evan being taken back through the door that led to the county lockup. I sobbed and ran from the courtroom with Betty right behind me. I think he saw me run out, but I'm not sure. It took us 3 days to put the bail deal together. Betty had to convince Brian that it was in our best interest to get Evan out of jail. He finally relented and agreed to the terms we were going to propose to Evan's attorney. Evan had to give Betty and me a chance to defend what had happened and why. He had to be made to see I only screwed Brian to have children. I contacted Evan's attorney as soon as we had the bail lined up and went to see him that same day. I told him that we would provide the bail if Evan would be willing to meet with us at Brian's hospital room. He called me the next morning and said that Evan had agreed and we would be at the hospital at 5 p.m. Betty immediately posted the bail. I dressed in an outfit that I knew Evan liked and got to Brian's room about 10 minutes before Evan was due there. I was a nervous wreck. I had to convince Evan that there was nothing between Brian and me. Evan opened the door at exactly 5 o'clock. He looked from one to the other of us without actually acknowledging any of us. A smile seemed to pull at the corner of his mouth as he inspected Brian's bandaged face. Evan just stood and waited. Finally, his lawyer said, "You ladies asked for this meeting, so please explain why we are here." I rose to my feet a little unsteady and replied, "Evan, we are so sorry. There was sex between Brian and I, but it was solely for making a baby. There was and is no love between us." Betty knew about this whole thing, and it was even her idea. Please forgive us all for lying to you. We never intended for you to find out. We hoped you would go to your grave thinking Sophie and our new baby were yours. That was my hope and prayer." Evan looked disgusted and simply asked, "Making a baby? What the hell are you talking about?" "Well, after so long it became apparent that with your low sperm count, we were never going to conceive a child. I was becoming desperate for a baby. I had many long soul-wrenching conversations with Betty about it. She was the one that came up with the idea that obviously Brian was a really fertile guy. You and he look a lot alike, so a baby by either of you could easily pass for the other's child. It took her a while to convince Brian that if he helped me conceive a child, our marriage would actually be stronger and more complete. She played on his deep feelings for you as his best friend, and he finally caved into the idea. I explained him when we have first started, and when and what happened. I did my best to accomplish it. The sex was simply to make a baby. It was not for enjoyment or love or lust. It was for our Sophie. Recently, I decided I wanted one more child, a boy if possible, so we conspired to create another baby. I'm so sorry that you found out and jumped to the wrong conclusions." "So the sex was just to make a baby?" Evan asked. "Yes. And you only did it until you knew you were pregnant?" "Oh, yes." Evan looked at Betty and asked, "And you knew about this and it was okay with you?" Betty smiled sadly and nodded her head. "We tried to give the ultimate gift to you too. I'm so sorry it was received so badly. We should have brought you in on it and hoped that you would understand. I can see why you were so upset." Evan looked hard at Betty and let out a sigh. "Betty, I am no longer upset about anything. After beating the crap out of Brian, I lost all anger. I'm just sorry that you have been suckered into this too." "What do you mean?" "Betty, I have proof that this was more than sex to make a baby." "What evidence?" I sobbed. "There is no evidence. I'm not like that. I did this for the children." Evan sighed and looked tired as he replied, "No, Lila, you may have thought that, but an objective person hearing you two talk would think otherwise. It may have started that way, but it is not that way now." "Is it?" "I don't know what you mean." I almost yelled at him. I was getting so angry. "All right, if you must prolong this farce, then let's just hear the evidence and ask a few simple questions. Your answers to those questions will determine the futures of everyone in this room and all of our children." Evan reached in his bag and pulled out that infamous memory stick with audio recordings he had made in our house. He had taped the conversations I had with Brian when we were screwing there over those last 3 days. At that moment, I knew I was lost. Evan and Betty both heard that bullshit stuff that Brian and I used to say to each other to heat up the passion. Evan's taped conversations showed that I lied with each answer I made to Evan's questions. He asked me if the sex was just to make a baby, and I said yes it was. He played part of taped conversation between Brian and me that, when listened to, seemed to imply we were actually true lovers. Brian and I both knew the real truth, but Brian couldn't talk, and anything I said sounded trite and unacceptable to Evan. Hell, it even sounded that way to me. He played part of Brian in my taper-off session where I gave him a BJ. That helped seal my fate with both Evan and Betty, since no way in hell is a BJ part of clinically getting pregnant. Finally, he played the tapes to completion that showed Brian and I had gotten together several times after I found out I was pregnant. This truly cemented my doom. Betty walked over to me and slapped me hard on the face and yelled, "You lousy bitch." She stormed out of the room. Evan reached in his bag and pulled out some papers. He handed me a set of papers and said in a very deflated voice, "You were a good wife, but not an honest wife. You lied, cheated, and made me a cuckold. You're hereby served with notice for divorce action on irreconcilable differences. If you contest it, you will hear this recording and others in court. Your call, 304. All I could do was nod. He then told me that my credit cards were now invalid and our bank accounts were closed. In the papers was a cashier's check for half of our liquid assets. Evan threw a set of papers on Brian's bed and with hatred in his voice said, "Hole, these papers indicate that I am suing you for back child support for your scumsucker child. You will pay me $50,000 and establish a college trust for Sophie and this new scumsucker you have on the way. We will have the trust administered by Reverend Fuller, our church pastor, and you will tell him exactly why you have to provide the trust. I want our church members to know just what a slime both you and Lila are. You will also acknowledge to Sophie that you are now her daddy. Got it?" All Brian could do was nod. Evan turned back to me and spat, "I'm sure Betty is going to have a few more things for you to do, but that is between you and her. As far as Betty and you are concerned, I hope she can someday forgive you, Lila. I now have to run and pick up Sophie. I have to tell her that I am not her daddy anymore." I was near panic. "No, please, don't do that. She's only 4. She will not understand. Can't we wait for a few years and then tell her? You just want to keep lying, don't you? You pathetic piece of trash." "No, It stops now. I will tell her today and be done with it. Whether you two want to step up to your responsibilities and this is your business, not mine. Evan roared at me. Evan turned and left the room. All that could be heard was me sobbing and Brian moaning in a state of shock and physical pain. Betty came back in and stared at us for a moment. She walked over and slapped me again. She said, "We're done as sisters." She turned to Brian and said, "When you get out of here, find somewhere else to live. I'll cut what's left of those nuts off myself if you come home." The next morning, Brian tried to renege on the agreement with Evan and have him prosecuted. I couldn't let Evan go to jail for something that I'd caused. Sophie couldn't have a jailbird as a father. I worked on Brian for days and days to get him to relent. When Evan got wind that Brian was going back on the deal we had made, Evan skipped bail. He didn't skip it to run away. No, he skipped out to cause Brian extra pain. As soon as he skipped, the bail was revoked by and lost to the court. Since Brian's business had been put up for collateral, the bail bondsman, to recover his money, placed the business in receivership. Brian finally just gave up after seeing his marriage die, his business taken from him, and me bitching at him every day about how he was as much to blame for this whole mess as I was. He just wanted to leave town and try to forget any of this ever happened. When Evan left the hospital room that day, he had declared he was going to tell Sophie, our little 4-year-old daughter, that he wasn't her father. I couldn't imagine him actually doing that, but he did. He actually told her that Brian was her real father and he, Evan, was just her uncle. The poor little thing was so confused and sad. I knew he had done it when I walked in the house and saw the look on his face. I yelled at him, "Evan, how could you? She is only 4 years old. She can't possibly understand this whole thing." Evan raised his hand and yelled back, "Lila, just shut up. You brought this on yourself and have impacted innocent little Sophie and me. I've told Sophie that Brian's her father, and it was your decision. And by God, it was your decision the first time you slept with that a-hole." I fell to my knees and tried to reason with him. "Oh, Evan, you just don't understand why I did what I did or how little Brian means to me." Evan stood up and walked to the garage door. He opened the door and then turned to me and said, "I guess I don't and I really don't care to know at this time. All I know is your child is upstairs in tears, and there is nothing I can do to make it better. I suggest you go tend to Sophie's emotional needs and I will go tend to mine." He left the house and never set foot in it again. Betty had told our parents what I had done with Brian, and now they thought I was trash. Sleeping with your brother-in-law does not endear yourself to a straight and narrow set of parents. Actually, my mom still had some contact with me, but my father refused to allow me in the house or anyone in the family to talk to me. So my mom had to sneak around to get some time with me and to help me out from time to time. It was really rough on her, and she started drinking to calm her nerves, as she put it. I convinced Evan to meet me at a local pub a few weeks later. I told him I needed a chance to explain and to seek his forgiveness. It was a disastrous meeting. Every time I tried to explain what had happened and why he threw it back in my face. By the time the meeting was over, I really understood how he saw my actions. Sophie was becoming more and more of a discipline problem since Evan had made his announcement to her and left her life. I had gone through all of the available sitters, and none would even return my calls now. My family had basically disowned me except for those rare occasions when Mom could sneak away and spend some time with me. Brian had left town, and I didn't know where he had gone. But then, I really didn't care about him anyway. I was several months along on the pregnancy now. What with the stress of Evan's discovering the truth, my sleepless nights of guilt, no appetite, and Sophie's rebellion against me, the pregnancy was not going well. I had to visit the doctor almost weekly because I was afraid the baby would suffer from my problems. I finally got up the nerve to approach Evan about sitting Sophie while I had my doctor's appointments. He at first balked because I was going to the doctor to tend to Brian's scumsucker baby, as he put it. I almost gave up and started to walk away when he relented and said he would sit her and maybe help get her emotionally stable again. I think he felt some regrets for exposing poor little Sophie to the whole sordid mess. I have to say I was still hoping against hope that Evan would come around and forgive me. So I did the very worst thing I could do to the situation. I tried to use Sophie to turn Evan back to us. I kept saying to her, "Uncle Brian had only helped Mommy make you and your new brother or sister. He helped me a lot to get you born. But your daddy will always be Evan. He's your real daddy." I knew she would throw that up to Evan at every opportunity. I counted on his anger melting away when he looked into those innocent eyes pleading with him to be her daddy. I dropped her off and heard her calling Evan daddy. I smiled to myself as I drove away, knowing she would be working on Evan the entire time I was at the doctor's office. I'd win him back with her help. I was stunned when I returned to Evan's to pick her up. I was immediately blasted by Evan for filling her head with such bullshit. I didn't relent. I kept telling Sophie that Evan loved her and was her daddy. He kept telling her it wasn't true and that Brian was her daddy. Sophie spiraled further down into rebelling against both of us because she was now so confused. But I screwed up again and failed to see how mentally scarred our little girl was getting over Evan and my radically different positions. This finally came to a head in the 6th week of Evan watching her while I went to the doctor. Evan announced, "Lila, I can't watch Sophie anymore. This crap you're filling her head with about me being her father is just poisoning her and me. Get someone else to watch her because I just can't see her being pulled apart like this anymore." At that moment, I knew all was lost. He had rejected Sophie to save himself. He refused to forgive me or even acknowledge there might be a chance someday. I angrily turned to leave with Sophie in tow and vowed, "Okay, Evan, you win. I will tell her tonight that Brian is her father and you are not. Happy now?" "No, Lila, I am not happy. But what has to be done has to be done. Maybe we can set up some more visits with me after the shock of you talking with her wears off." "I still do love." "I don't think so." I stopped him. "You either are in her life or you are not. I can't go on like this either. I'll get Mom to watch her." Evan got a concerned look on his face and said something like, "Don't do that. Your mom's an alcoholic. Sophie isn't safe with her when she is drinking." I ignored him and left. Then I made my last big mistake. In fact, it is the worst mistake I ever made. I gave the care of my little girl over to my mom while I went to the doctor. And, I have to confess this, I knew she had been drinking when she picked Sophie up that last time. I just didn't want to admit it. Evan wrote, "Mom drove through a red light and was hit by a large truck. She was killed instantly and my little girl gravely injured and in a deep coma. I couldn't bear to go to the hospital to see her because I knew it was my fault. My world crashed down as I finally got it through my head that this whole was my fault. I was told by a nurse that Evan was spending part of every day with Sophie. He read to her, brushed her hair, washed her face, and just loved her. Then my father committed suicide because he couldn't live without my mother, and he blamed me for her death. I know this because he wrote it in his suicide note. I totally broke down and had to be helped away from the gravesite. Yes, I had killed Dad, just as I had killed Mom, just as I had killed Evan's love for me. It was just a few days later that I looked inward and saw that calm place. That place had a beautiful pond, pastures with golden flowers, ever-radiant sun-drenched skies, and a beautiful home with Evan, Sophie, our new baby boy, my mom and dad and Betty. We were all happy and always laughing and hugging. I want to live there in my mind. I don't remember anything of the real world for what they tell me was almost 6 years. I do remember fragments of the dream world. I remember making love to Evan only to have his face and body morph into Brian. We would begin those hot sexual sessions again. After it was over and I came down from the sexual high, he would morph back into Evan who would be holding me and stroking my hair. Why is Brian injecting himself into my wonderful life? I used to ask myself in that dream world. I vaguely remember that one day while I was playing with my children, Evan approached and said, "Please forgive me. I was wrong, and I forgive you for everything." At the time, it made no sense to me. One day I was making love to Evan, and he changed into Brian and I asked him, "Why are you here?" "I don't want you. I want Evan." He laughed in reply and said, "This is your dream, not mine. I'm here because you still think about me, and about what we used to do to each other." I bolted up and yelled, "No. Evan and my children are my life. You've nothing to do with it now. Go away." And he faded into nothingness with those words. I actually didn't say those things. I tried to, but it had been years since I said anything and my vocal cords just wouldn't work yet. But I did sit straight up in the bed and suddenly found myself back in reality. Needless to say, the doctors were amazed that I had found my way back after so long. They slowly exposed me to the world again. One day, I remembered all of the hurt and pain with Evan and Sophie and my parents, and I cried in great sobs. The doctors said that was good. I had to let it out and try to deal with it. There was still a lot of things I didn't remember. A week later, they told me my dad had committed suicide after my mom had died. I was extremely sad about that. I had long since forgiven myself for my errors in judgment that led up to the disastrous life I had when I went away. About 4 days after I returned to the real world, it suddenly dawned on me that I had been pregnant, the last thing I remembered. I asked the doctor about my baby. He cleared his throat and said, "Yes, you gave birth to a baby boy. He is now a little over 5 years old and lives with his father." "Brian has my baby?" I said in a panic. "Where is he?" The doctor looked confused. "No, I don't know any Brian. The baby is with your ex-husband, Evan." "What? I don't believe it. How did Evan end up with my baby?" I wailed. "Well, he is the father. So he claimed his right to take over raising the boy." "What do you mean?" Brian is the father. Evan walked away. It's not Evan's. The doctor looked almost amused. Lila, calm down. I don't know what has you so confused, but unless DNA testing is totally inaccurate, your ex-husband Evan is 99.9998% likely to be the father. Now I was totally confused. How could Evan be the father? Brian was the one that pumped all of that potent seed into me. I steeled myself and asked, is there any way I can see my baby boy? What's his name? What does he look like? The nurse accompanying the doctor stepped forward and said, his name is Evan Brian Carter. He looks just like his father. Evan Brian Carter? Who named him Brian? Well, I believe it was young Evan's and Sophie's stepmother, your ex-husband's wife. Her name is Betty. You know she looks a lot like you. The nurse replied, Betty married my Evan? My sister married my husband? I shook my head trying to grasp what I was being told. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know about your sister. But, yes, I believe that is what happened. It suddenly hit me that he had said Betty was Sophie's stepmother. Sophie was alive. I quickly asked the doctor, my Sophie is alive? She recovered from the accident? Why, yes, she is a healthy young woman now. You'd never know she had been in such a bad accident. She is. You never answered my question. Is there any way to see my daughter and son? I asked, interrupting him. I was more than a little afraid to hear the answer. Well, yes. We've just been waiting for you to recall the fact you had a baby and come to grips with him being over 5 years old now. The doctor stated. He continued, Mr. and Mrs. Carter actually have brought Evan and Sophie to see you on every one of their birthdays since you've been here. They point to you and tell him that you're his real mother and that you love him, but you are very sick. He's actually kissed you each time and said that he loved you. Sophie simply runs over and caresses your hair and kisses your cheek each time she has been to see you. She comes quite a bit just to sit with you. She reads you stories from her books. I was thunderstruck. The doctor moved toward the door and stated, I'll call Mr. Carter right now and see if I can arrange a visit. He and his wife have been very interested in your recovery, and since they are assigned as your medical surrogates, they have every right to be kept abreast of your status. My medical surrogates? They've been making medical decisions on my behalf? Why would they do that? I just couldn't figure out what was happening. It was 2 days before a visit could be arranged and I was on pins and needles awaiting their arrival. The nurse had brought in her makeup case, and we had worked all morning for me to look presentable. I was now dressed in a nice-looking running suit that hid my skinny body. The doctors had kept me alive, but I had lost tons of weight while I was away. It was 2 in the afternoon, and they were due to arrive any minute. I was jumpy and nervous and terrified. What could I say to Evan? Or say to Betty? Or say to my child I had never met? What do I say to the child I left behind? I was still pondering these questions when the door burst open and entered a small bundle of pure energy about 3.5 feet tall. He looked exactly like Evan. He bounded in, yelling, Mommy! Mommy! Are you really awake? He ran to my arms and I hugged him with all of the strength I could muster. I kissed his face and he kissed me back. I finally said, Yes, baby, I'm awake. I'm sorry I was so sick. He pulled back a bit and looked me in the eye. Daddy said that you would come back to us someday. He was right. Weren't you, Daddy? He turned and looked at the door. Standing there was Evan, a slightly heavier and older version than I remember, but still my Evan. He smiled and replied laughing, You bet, partner. I heard a noise and turned my head to see Sophie approaching my bed. Not the Sophie I remember, but a beautiful young woman with tears in her eyes. She held out her arms and hugged me. Mom, I've missed you. Welcome back to us. I began to speak when Betty walked out from behind Evan and grabbed his arm. She looked at me and smiled. Hi, sis. It's been a long time. I gasped. She called me sis. I couldn't understand. She was so mad at me last time I saw her. After visiting with my children for a few minutes, the kids looked at Evan then went to get a soda. Evan and Betty came over to the bed and each grabbed a hand. We're so glad you're back with us, Evan exclaimed. Betty laughed as she kissed the back of my hand. Now I was totally and completely lost. Evan hated me. I'd dishonored our marriage and he had left me. I'd screwed up again by allowing my mother to sit for Sophie, and as such was nearly responsible for her death. How could these two be so happy to see me? I hesitantly said hi and asked that question to them as I began to cry. Evan squeezed my hand and said, It's been a lot of years. The pain of everything is long gone. Betty convinced me I had to forgive you, or she would not marry me. I must have looked dejected because Betty said, Sis, I know for you it feels like yesterday, but it has been almost 6 years. I had children that needed a father, and Evan had your children that needed a mother. We both had felt similar pain from the results of my terrible idea. We both needed to be held and wanted. It took Evan quite a while to even trust me after my role in that whole fiasco. But eventually he forgave me. I'd already forgiven you since I was the one that threw you and Brian together. I had to forgive you before I could forgive myself. Betty stopped long enough to compose herself and then continued. When Evan asked me to marry him, I could tell he was still carrying a bitterness that would eventually destroy him and the family he so desperately wanted. I worked with him for months, showing him how the whole set of events had really been no one's premeditated actions to cuck him. Things which were intended to be good just went bad as it all got out of hand. He really does know that you adored him even when you were with Brian. He finally came to see you one day, and even though you didn't hear him, he asked for your forgiveness. I remember that. At the time, it was just a random event that imposed itself on my dream world. But I do remember Evan asking for my forgiveness and granting me his forgiveness, I said excitedly. Evan smiled and said, "That's right. You were here sometimes, weren't you?" Betty continued, "Sis, I'm married to Evan now. We love each other. We are raising a wonderful group of kids. Your children are precious to us. But we understand that a mother needs to be with and to know her son and daughter as they need you. So we offer you every other weekend with little Evan and Sophie. If you want, you can also come to our holiday get-togethers as well. Plus, you can visit our home and them almost any time. Just call first. I miss our coffee talks." After the kids came back in another 20 minutes, Evan and Betty could see I was tiring out. So they hustled the kids out of the door. I said as loudly as I could, "Guys, can you two stay for a moment?" Betty gave Sophie some money and told her to go to the vending machine and get themselves ice cream sandwiches. The kids ran off and left us alone in my room. I had to know something and tried to ask, "How is little Evan is considered Evan's son?" "I mean me and Brian. You know Brian and I, we..." Evan laughed. "Well, Lila, it appears that even though he tried, I was the one that popped the cork for you. Apparently that one night of hot and heavy passion we had was enough to get us the baby so you desperately wanted." Betty squeezed my hand to get my attention and said, "We had our own baby 2 years ago, little Sarah. And I'm pregnant again." I lay back on the bed pillow and thought about everything. If I had asked Evan for the money to use Brian's sperm, or if I had stuck with Brian to the clinical approach with no passion, or if I had not wanted a second child, or if I had simply tried to heat up my loving husband like I had Brian, none of this would have happened. I sighed and thought if only. As my grandfather used to tell me, wish in one hand and spit in the other, and see which one gets full first. But I was determined to make things better and be the moral person I knew I could be. I accepted their offer and spent many a happy time at their house playing with the children and loving my son and daughter. I finally came to grips with how my actions had caused the irrevocable destruction of my family. It had finally dawned on me that I had enjoyed the sex with Brian. Not that I had any feelings for him, but I did reach the point where my enjoyment of our times together outweighed the initial reason of why we were together. I had become a 304 in many ways, no matter what excuse I tried to make in my defense. I had several lengthy crying sessions with Evan and Betty trying to express my deepest apologizes and accepting the blame for all that had transpired. I met and married a wonderful man last year. We're now expecting our first baby, or rather babies as I'm having twins. Both Sophie and Evan are happy about having a couple of new brothers or sisters. Evan and Betty are well and very happy together. And what, you may ask, happened to Brian? We have no idea what has happened to him. All I know is Betty and I dragged him into something that became more than he and I could handle. Who knows, maybe someday we'll find out what happened to him, but that would be another story. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.